For over 60 years, Bob Newhart was comedy's definition of harmless. He was the master of the gentle stammer, the quiet observation, and the perfectly timed pause. In a world of chaos, he was the button-down mind, America's most patient man. He was the one guy in Hollywood everyone seemed to agree on, a professional, a gentleman, a friend. But behind the scenes of his hit show, one man pushed that legendary patience to its absolute limit. Day after day, this relentless antagonist tested Newhart, backing him into a corner and driving him to a breaking point few ever saw. This is the story of that quiet war, fought not with angry words but with sighs of desperation and looks of utter disbelief. And the identity of the man who provoked him is one of Hollywood's most fascinating secrets. To get the full picture, you first have to understand the man Bob Newhart was to the world. And that man was, in a word, unflappable. He didn't burst onto the comedy scene, he sort of shuffled into it by accident. While working a boring job as an accountant in Chicago, Newhart and a friend would kill time with long, improvised phone calls, creating ridiculous scenarios to escape the monotony. Those calls led to a demo tape, which landed him a contract with Warner Brothers. Records, his first album, The Button-Down Mind of Bob Newhart, was a sensation. It shot to #1 on the Billboard charts, sitting alongside giants like Elvis Presley and the cast of The Sound of Music. At the time, it was the biggest-selling comedy album in history. The world had fallen for his unique style. Newhart didn't really tell jokes. He reacted to them. His most famous routines were one-sided. Phone calls where he played the straight man to some unseen madmen. He was the driving instructor with a hopeless student, Abraham Lincoln's press agent, or a security guard at the Empire State Building trying to explain King Kong. The genius wasn't in the punchline, but in his pauses, his stammers, his quiet, barely contained frustration. He made listening funny, and that persona wasn't just an act. By all accounts, the real Bob Newhart was just as low-key. His friendships were legendary, often with his comedic opposites. His best friend was Don Rickles, the king of insult comics. The image of the gentle Newhart vacationing with the loud, aggressive Rickles was a running joke in Hollywood, a perfect example of Newhart's easygoing nature. Colleagues from his shows always described the sets as friendly, collaborative, and fun. Marsha Wallace, who played his sharp-tongued receptionist, Carol, remembered him as a gentle soul who almost never complained. He was a pro's pro, loved by his cast, respected by his peers, adored by the public. He was a family man with a reputation for steady success and goodwill. And that's what makes the story of the man he supposedly hated so compelling. Because the conflict wasn't loud or public. It was a quiet, internal battle that played out for years, hidden in plain sight. In 1972, Bob Newhart became Dr. Bob Hartley on The Bob Newhart Show. The setup was perfect for his style of comedy. He played a successful Chicago psychologist, surrounded by a universe of eccentrics. Once again, he was the calm center in a storm of absurdity. The cast was brilliant. Suzanne Plachette played his sharp, independent wife, Emily. And their on-screen chemistry was matched by a deep off-screen friendship. Peter Bonners was Jerry Robinson, a neurotic orthodontist who shared the office suite. Marsha Wallace was Carol Kester, the sassy receptionist. And then there was Howard Borden, the Hartleys' intrusive neighbor, played by Newhart's real-life friend, Bill Daly. The show was a huge hit. It's a key part of CBS's legendary Saturday night lineup. By all accounts, the set was a joy. Bill Daly remembered how he and Newhart would constantly make each other laugh, sometimes so much that they'd have to retake scenes. They were old friends, and you could see that genuine affection on screen. So if everyone loved Bob, where's the conflict? The clues aren't in the off-screen drama, but in the relentless on-screen dynamic. Dr. Bob Hartley's life was a prison of politeness. His job forced him to listen to the endless anxieties of his bizarre therapy patients. His office neighbor was a bundle of insecurities, His home life was a revolving door for his needy neighbor, Howard. Every week for 6 seasons, Bob Newhart went to work to play a man who was constantly, quietly being driven nuts. He was the rock that wave after wave of neurosis crashed against. He could never scream. He could never lose his temper. He could only absorb the chaos with a look of strained tolerance. It was brilliant comedy, but you have to wonder if, for the man at its center, it was a kind of psychological marathon. The problem wasn't one single person. It was all of them. But which one truly represented the peak of his frustration? The first and most obvious suspect is Howard Borden, played by Bill Daly. In the show's universe, Howard was more than a neighbor. He was an invasive force of nature. He'd burst in without knocking to borrow food, appliances, or just a bit of their sanity. He was a needy man-child who was completely dependent on the Hartleys' patience. For Dr. Bob Hartley, Howard was a walking case study. But for Bob Newhart, the actor, it presented a different kind of challenge. He and Bill Daly were dear friends. In real life, a bond that started in Chicago comedy clubs long before Hollywood. But it's often in our closest relationships that the biggest annoyances can grow. On screen, Daly's performance as Howard was high energy and chaotic. Newhart's performance, by necessity, was all quiet, slow-burning reaction. For a comedian whose entire career was built on the power of the pause, was it a private, professional hell to share so many scenes with a performer as manic as Bill Daly? Think about the repetition. For 144 episodes, Newhart had to stand there, his face a perfect mask of polite suffering, while Daly, as Howard, barged in and raided his fridge. The comedy came from Newhart's reaction. But Howard was always the one lighting the fuse. Publicly, there was nothing but love between them. Their friendship was real and lasted until Daly's death. But it's a fascinating dynamic from a professional standpoint. Newhart was the ultimate pro and would never have complained. He just channeled it into the masterful performance that made Dr. Bob so relatable. He was trapped. How do you tell your oldest friend that the very thing he does to get a laugh is professionally driving you up a wall? Oh, you don't? You stand there, you take it, and you let the camera capture the silent scream in your eyes. If Bill Daly was the chaotic assault on Newhart's patience, the next suspect represents a more subtle, professional friction. Peter Bonners, who played Dr. Jerry Robinson, the orthodontist next door. The dynamic between Bob and Jerry was built on a different kind of tension. They were colleagues, peers, and, in some ways, rivals for sanity in an office dominated by their eccentric patients. Peter Bonners and Bob Newhart had a lot in common and an easy rapport, but their professional roles were complicated. Bonners wasn't just an actor, he was also a budding director. He directed 29 episodes of The Bob Newhart Show and later became a go-to director for huge sitcoms like Murphy Brown and Friends. This created a unique situation on set. You have Newhart, the established star whose name is on the marquee. And then you have Bonners, his scene partner, who was also, on many days, his director. The characters themselves were a study in contrasts. Bob Hartley listened to problems. Jerry Robinson was the problem, constantly unloading his anxieties about his dating life and career, turning their office into a free therapy clinic for himself. While Howard's intrusions were loud, Jerry's were a quiet, constant drain. Again, there are no public records of any arguments or feuds. The set was known for being professional. But the tension wasn't personal. It was situational. The entire structure of the show is built on the premise of Bob Newhart's quiet suffering. He was the sun, and a solar system of neurotics revolved around him. But the true source of this legendary frustration wasn't on the set of The Bob Newhart Show at all. To find it, we have to travel forward in time to a new show, a new town, and a whole new level of madness. For years after his first show ended, Bob Newhart returned to TV in 1982 with a sitcom called Simply Newhart. The premise seemed like a gentle evolution. Newhart played Dick Loudon, an author who moves to rural Vermont with his wife, Joanna, to run a historic. It sounded like the same cozy, character-driven comedy. But it was a trap. The new show wasn't just more of the same. It was an amplification of the old formula to an almost surreal degree. If the characters in Chicago were eccentric, the residents of this small Vermont town were certifiably insane. The Stratford Inn was a magnet for the bizarre, and at the center of it all was Dick Loudon, who was basically Bob Hartley in a different sweater, the one sane man in a universe that had detached from reality. And this is where we find him. The man Bob Newhart truly grew to hate more than anyone. It wasn't a co-star. It wasn't a producer. It wasn't a network executive. The man that Bob Newhart, arguably, grew to despise, the one who tested his patience beyond all measure, was the very character. He had to become every single week for 8 years. Dick Loudon. You could argue that he hated him. He hated him because Dick Loudon was a prisoner in a quaint colonial hell of his own making. He bought an inn for peace and quiet, only to be surrounded by a level of absurdity that made Bob Hartley's life look like a silent retreat. Let's look at the supporting cast. There was George Utley, the handyman, played by Newhart's friend Tom Poston, a simple man who misunderstood everything. Then there was Kirk, the cafe owner who was a pathological liar. But the true avatars of madness were 3 brothers: Larry, his brother Daryl, and his other brother Daryl. A trio of backwoodsmen where only Larry spoke, while his 2 brothers remained completely silent. Imagine being Bob Newhart. You go to work, stand on your mark, and have entire scenes with 2 actors who never say a single word. The entire comedic burden falls on you to react to their silent, imposing presence. Day after day, year after year. The men you consider your friends and colleagues transform the moment the cameras roll into the source of your unending professional torment. Dick Loudon could never win. Every attempt to bring logic to a situation was met with a tidal wave of insanity. He was a man screaming into a void of pleasant, smiling madness. And Bob Newhart, the master of the slow burn, had to live in that frustration for 8 long years. He was trapped, and after nearly a decade, he found the ultimate way to get his revenge. As Newhart neared its end, the star was ready to move on. The writers planned a finale where a Japanese tycoon buys the town, forcing everyone to leave. But Bob Newhart's wife, Ginny, had a different, more radical idea. An idea so brilliant and so wild, it would allow Bob to finally get the last laugh on the character who had trapped him for a decade. The final episode, The Last Newhart, aired on May 21, 1990. For most of its runtime, it plays out as expected. The town is sold, and 5 years later, all the insane residents return to the inn, just as bizarre as ever. Overwhelmed, Dick Loudon runs out and gets knocked unconscious by a stray golf ball. And then, it happens. The screen cuts to black. We fade in on a familiar bedroom set. Bob, as Dick Loudon wakes up. He turns to his wife in bed and says, "Honey, you won't believe the dream I just had." But the woman who sits up is not Joanna Loudon. It's Suzanne Plachette. She is Emily Hartley. He is Bob Hartley. They are back in their Chicago apartment from the Bob Newhart Show. The entire 8-tier run of Newhart, every absurd character, every frustrating moment, every silent brother Daryl was just a bizarre nightmare. A bad dream brought on by, as Emily suggests, probably too much Japanese food before bed. With one scene, Bob Newhart didn't just end a TV show. He annihilated a universe. In the ultimate meta-joke, he erased Dick Loudon from existence. He wiped out the entire town of Stratford, Vermont. He silenced Larry, his brother Daryl, and his other brother Daryl forever. It was a brutal, brilliant act of comedic genius. It was the perfect escape for a man who had been pushed to his absolute limit, using his power to get the last laugh on the man who had tormented him for 8 years. He wasn't just ending a series. He was reclaiming his sanity. The biggest feud of Bob Newhart's career wasn't with a person, but with a persona. His enemy wasn't a co-star, but the very character the world loved him for being, the infinitely patient straight man. His legendary career was a quiet war fought against the forces of absurdity. And in the end, with one of the greatest twists in television history, he finally won.